start right now, I think. And this is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sudeep Bhatia. Professor Bhatia is a highly accomplished scholar. He has published in the very top journals, including Science, PNAS, Management Science, and I was not able to count how many psych review papers, to mention just some of them. Professor Bhatia studies cognitive biases of human judgment and decision making using, among others, large language models, which I assume we'll hear about more today. He also has a very impressive microphone, I have to admit. I don't have such one. And we will proceed as follows. Now we will have about 45 to 50 minutes for your presentation, and then about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And then those who have to go will be able to go. And if it's fine with you, we will stay for another 15 or 20 minutes of informal discussion. And now, Sudeep, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Let me share my screen. Um, so, yeah, it's it's a great pleasure to talk to this group. I think there's so many commonalities and so many shared interests. Most of us work with decision making. Let's see. I just want to make sure my slides. You can see my slides, right? Yeah, the main slides. Okay. Yeah, so most of us work with decision making, and we oftentimes use paradigms like the ones that I've shown you on this screen. Hey, and maybe give people some risky choices with some gamble amounts and probabilities, or maybe we ask them to learn from experience by pulling on levers, or maybe we study attributes, so quality and price, and sometimes we might even want to abstract from those kinds of attributes and just give them rewards associated with different features of simple shapes, let's say like the color or the fill. So this is a standard paradigm in the cognitive study of decision making. It's very important. I think it gives researchers a lot of experimental control, and a lot of important insights have been gained from this paradigm. But as much as I love working with this kind of stimuli, I didn't get into the field to study such abstract decisions, right? When I was, younger, when I decided what I want to do with my life, I wanted to study real choices, like important choices, choices that carry existential weight, choices that can change the trajectory of someone's life. So let me give you an example of such a choice from our data set. This is one choice from 100,000 choice problems that we've collected that people have posted online on a social media website, Reddit. I'll tell you about it in just a second. This isn't a randomly selected problem. I was just filtering based on age and gender. So I'm 37-year-old. This is the first post made by a 37-year-old male on this website. And, we can read through it if you like, but maybe that's not particularly necessary. I think what I want to sort of show with this slide is that these kinds of dilemmas are really important, right? And they're ubiquitous. We know people who are facing these. We know for them that what they choose is going to completely alter the rest of their lives. It's going to completely change their life outcomes. And wouldn't it be nice if we could take our models, our methods, and extend them to these kinds of choice problems? Now, I'm not saying we should be relationship therapists or anything like that, but it would be nice if we could, for example, extract the attributes, specify decision weights, and maybe even predict response probabilities. Now, we can't do that. And the reason we cannot do that is not because our models aren't good. Our models are actually perfectly fine. It's because we don't really focus on the task of extracting attributes in real-world choice scenarios. We focus primarily on the task of fitting models to artificial attributes, oftentimes in the context of a lab experiment. And there's a reason for this. Okay, our field is very much founded during the information processing revolution that happened in the 1950s and 60s. And this revolution, as many of you know, it came out of the growth of computers and their popularity in science and society. Psychologists saw them as analogs for the mind, so maybe the mind is also a computer. And if you take this perspective seriously, then you start asking questions like, how does the mind process information? What are the heuristics or rules or mechanisms at play in decision making? And that's very much the perspective that guides our research today. But of course, we're in the middle of another computer revolution. It's not the information processing revolution. I would argue it's the information representation revolution. Uh, and really, it stems from the fact that over the past 20 years, a lot of digital data has been made available via the internet, and large language models, as well as other kinds of deep neural networks, have been trained on this data. And their success comes from their ability to extract representations from this data, representations about the world. Okay, so it's not about processing. Um, it's about, in some sense, getting the knowledge out of the data. Um, and then if you take this revolution seriously, then you ask a slightly different set of questions. Instead of asking how does the mind process information, maybe you ask what is the information that the mind processes in many everyday tasks. Okay, instead of asking what are the heuristics or rules that play in decision making, you might ask what are the attributes and reasons that go into these heuristics and these decision mechanisms. Okay. And so that's kind of the perspective motivating this work. I'm using a large digital data set and various LLM techniques to extract attributes and study everyday choices, computationally, mathematically. All right, so the data set that I use is this big data set on the social media website Reddit. It's got about, if you look over here, about 1 million members. People post very regularly. They ask about advice on everyday decision problems. I've got a couple of, I would say 5 million posts from this data set, though we're not using all of them. I'll explain in just a second. In addition to this data set, we have a couple of other Reddit data sets, some more specific advice forums like Ask Men Advice, Ask Women Advice, Friendship Advice, Career Advice, and we also have a pre-registered representative sample of participants in the United States describing important life choices. Okay. Now, all of these data sets essentially give us large textual posts like the one I just showed you at the start, like this, right? So this is our data right now, big blurbs of text describing a difficult decision, an important decision. And we want to extract the attributes, and then we want to use that in some kind of computational modeling exercise. So how do we do that? As you can imagine, LLMs are very powerful. What we do is we take these posts, there are about 5 million in the advice data set. We then give them to GPT and ask it whether the post involves a binary choice. So we're limiting our data analysis to binary decisions just for simplicity. And if a post is a binary choice, we give it back to GPT and we ask it to tell us what the two options are, in its own words, that the decision maker is deliberating between. And then we give those options back to GPT and ask it to describe to us, in its own words, with text, the benefits and costs for each of the options as described in the text. Okay, so this gives us roughly about 100,000 choice problems, because the vast majority of the 5 million dilemmas on this website, they're not binary choices, they're maybe open-ended. But if we're looking for precise binary choices, we get around 100,000, most of them, again, from the advice subreddit, and then the rest of them from our smaller data sets. Feel free to interrupt if you have any clarification questions. I can also
here is
take them at
one.
the end.
For example, what you showed, should I stay or should I leave my current job? So this is kind of or stay or shift. But if you shift, there are many options, right? And usually they will describe many options. So how would ChatGPT will categorize such dilemmas?
Yeah, it's I wouldn't say it's perfectly precise, right? So there isn't, a very precise formula that determines whether or not it's a binary choice or a open-ended choice or something like that. I would say it very much matches the intuition that humans might have. So when we go and read it, if this person is saying, should I stay or should I leave my job or should I stay in my job? If I leave my job, I'll have maybe a few months of job search and blah 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 blah. If I stay, then I'll have whatever my job. That might be seen as a binary choice. If someone says, should I stay in my job or should I take job X or should I take job Y or should I take job Z, and here are the costs and benefits of each of these four actions, then that probably would not be a binary choice. I found that GPT tends to be a little bit conservative in what it considers to be a binary choice. So my hunch is, and again, we've done various validation studies, but we haven't, because we have a 5 million post data set, We haven't sort of looked through that entire data set more comprehensively. My hunch is that there are many binary choices that are not in our data set that should be in our data set, maybe just because they're not explicitly described in that way in the text.
Thanks. So just you don't tell ChatGPT anything specific except of if it's binary or not. You don't
Yeah, I
give
mean, we
specific
define what it
instructions.
means. We define it, and we give it a little bit more details in the prompt
Okay.
about what it means to be a binary choice. So, like, a choice between two, explicit options, where costs and benefits of each of the options are discussed, but we don't sort of give it examples.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and there are other ways to do this as well. And my experience, I've been working a lot with GPT as a human, as a surrogate for a human coder or human annotator, is that it's got the same limitations that humans do. So if humans have a difficulty solving a problem, I think it's going to have difficulty solving a problem. Okay, so we do this, and we take our post that we have here, and then GPT kind of extracts. This is a structure extraction step, right? It extracts the options, and it says, okay, option one is leave the family, and the benefits are, so and so and so, and these are all things that the poster mentions in the text, and then option two is continue to suffer for the sake of the kids. This is wording from the original text, so. And then there's some costs and benefits, and if you, again, I'll show you validation studies in just a second, but this is fairly reasonable. Of course, the limitation is that this is still text. This isn't a quantitative numerical attribute structure that we can feed into our model. So we need to do a little bit more analysis in order to convert this into that kind of quantitative attribute structure.
Just a
So
quick clarification question, please.
sure.
What is their motivation? Like they're posting it there because they ask for advice, or it is just they want to express like why people do that, or you have no idea?
Yeah. I would say the major reason is the need for advice. So they have an important life dilemma, and they want to get some feedback on it. Yes. I just saw an option in the chat. How do you make sure that that chat doesn't hallucinate? Yeah, that is a potential concern. So we do have a validation study. I'll show you in just a second, and yeah, that is a concern in the sense that it's possible that GPT could take its preconceptions about what let's say a divorce would entail and sort of feed that in. Now, to some extent, that's desirable, right? Like, we want it to sort of, if this person briefly says, I'm worried about the effects of the divorce on my kids, okay? You want GPT to use its understanding of the context and the text and the real world and the implications on the kids to say, well, actually, the effect on the kids is that they will, probably suffer, or they'll experience some kind of disutility or negative experience. So you want it to use background context, but you're right. There is a worry that that there might do some extreme hallucination. So mention things that aren't there. Okay, so we've got. Let me just go back one slide. We've got this kind of textual summary, if you will, structured textual summary of the costs and benefits of each option. Let's convert it into numbers. How do we do that? Well, that's not that easy, but we've been taking a top-down approach. So what we've done is first collect a bunch of attributes that we may want to code these textual reasons, these pros and cons, these costs and benefits on. Okay, and we've taken 207 distinct attributes from the literature, from the decision-making literature, the psychology literature, and the social psychology literature as well, not just cognitive, and taken those attributes, these sort of, let's call them concerns that people might have, and built for each of them a textual lexicon that then allows us to use further LLM methods to do text matching to figure out which of the attributes are reflected in a given GPT-generated reason, right? So again, like we always say, opportunity to pursue personal happiness and fulfillment, right? We should be able to then code that piece of text on, the 207 different attributes, some of which are explicitly happiness related. Okay, so here just is a summary of our attributes. Here we've got some from decision theory like safety and risk. We've got various types of decision outcomes. So money is a decision outcome that we might care about. We've got attributes from consumer behavior research like experiential consumption, emotions, self-determined values. We've got a lot of goals from the goal literature in social psychology. Moral foundations, person perception, like, I want to be seen as being good or want to be seen as being competent. Actually, this person does have a in his description. If you look at the second cost over here, this person does talk about he's worried about how other people will see him. That's a major concern that he has. So that's a person perception. And then we've got altruism and fairness and many of these other social preference attributes. Now, for each of these attributes, right, as I mentioned, we do have a textual lexicon that allows us to do coding. And that textual lexicon takes the form of various positive and negative sentences that would describe the manifestation of that attribute. So, for example, for the risk attribute, a positive sentence might be prevents risk, and a negative sentence, right, could be causes risk, and so on. So similar for all the other attributes. I'm not sure if this entire step is very clear, but what really you should take away from this is we end up getting from the literature phrases that describe good and bad instantiations of different attributes. And then we then take those phrases, right, and combine them with the phrases that GPT generates and match them using sentence embeddings, which are high-dimensional vector representations of the sentences, and then by doing so, translate the textual costs and benefits generated by GPT into a quantitative attribute structure, essentially 207 benefits and 207 costs.
Sudeep?
Yes.
So can you clarify again where these sentences, these positive and negative sentences for the attributes are coming from?
So these sentences, right? Yeah. So what we did was for each of these 207 attributes, we got 10 positive and 10 negative sentences that describe various ways in which that attribute would be sort of described in text. And we did this using a combination of our own typing out different examples, and of course we got help from ChatGPT to generate sort of different variants of the same phrasing. That was done a little bit more informally. So we sort of like, we took an attribute, we generate some examples. We're like, GPT, can you come up with other examples of this, a positive version of this attribute? And it come up with some, and we picked some based on our understanding of the literature. So it was more informal. It's definitely, I would say, driven by researcher intuition more than any formal GPT LLM probing pipeline. But yeah, LLMs, as in stimuli design and many other contemporary studies, LLMs are playing a role here as well.
Am I correct that you're counting the number of benefits and costs, or I completely missed something? In a sense,
thank you for bringing that. No, we're not. Yes. So what we're doing is we're taking, right? So each of these positive or negative sentences and each of the costs and benefits generated by GPT in our textual summarization step can be vectorized. So let's say for a given benefit, and remember that poster is worried that other people will see him negatively. Okay, we can, for that sentence that GPT generated, worried that other people will see me negatively, we can convert that into what's known as an embedding. It's a high-dimensional vector that captures the semantic content of that sentence. We used SBERT embeddings. I can get into technical details if people are interested, but we use basically a leading model that captures the semantic content of sentences in the form of high-dimensional vectors. Now, let's say for a given attribute, like warmth perception, there's a sentence in our warmth perception dictionary, right? In this stage, that says, that is a sentence describing being perceived negatively by others. That sentence can also be vectorized as a high-dimensional sentence embedding. And then we can match these, basically using cosine similarity, to see how similar a given GPT-generated sentence is to our attribute sentence to see for this post, for option 1, does it show up as a benefit or as a cost of each of our attributes? And we would expect, for example, to show up as a cost on the warmth perception attribute. Because the sentence embedding for the GPT summary of that cost is going to be similar to sentence embedding for a textual description of what it means to be low on warmth perception. So a lot of different moving parts here. So thank you for asking that question. I'm happy to elaborate. It took us a while to refine this pipeline. I mean, I can tell you, we could have even asked GPT to just rate each option on each of these 207 attributes, but then for each post and each option, we would have 500 prompts. That'd make it very expensive, right? So that's why we got GPT to generate a textual summary, and then we use some offline text embedding based approaches, and that basically greatly reduced the costs. Happy to elaborate if someone's interested. Okay. So what this gives us is essentially a attribute structure for each of the posts. Now I want to tell you a little bit about, just very quickly, the sort of overall frequencies of the attributes, just how common they are, and then I'll dig into what the actual results are. So here what I've done very, very, very quickly is taken each of our data sets. So we've got our advice. This is the main one, right? This row, and I've seen how correlated are the attributes in our advice with Ask Men Advice, Ask Women Advice, Career Advice, Friendship Advice, and Study One, which is a representative US sample. Okay, so I've done this in a pairwise manner. So right off the bat, you can see, for example, that Ask Men Advice, and Ask Women Advice tend to have like nearly identical attribute structures. And actually, Friendship Advice right here is actually quite a lot like Ask Men and Ask Women Advice. Career Advice is very different. That's this column right here. And the most important thing for our purposes is this cell, which shows that this main data set that we're analyzing with 90,000 binary choices is very similar to the attribute structures, okay, that we get when we apply this pipeline to a controlled lab study in which we ask people to describe recent important life choices. So this main data set is close to the representative sample that we get in a controlled study. Okay. It involves a mix of friendship, career, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be wondering, this 0.9 correlation, all right, very, pretty high correlation, but is there a mismatch between Reddit, the Reddit advice, and our representative US sample? There's a little mismatch. They're not perfectly correlated. There's some attributes that show up slightly more in this sample and some attributes that show up slightly more in this sample. I don't know if anyone has any guesses. I'll tell you one. one attribute that is fairly common in Reddit advice, but never shows up in our representative US sample is attributes related to sexual desirability. Okay. Now, which of these is more representative of human behavior, right? That's an interesting question. I don't think in this case our representative lab study is actually representative of what people think and talk about, because they're not going to talk about sex, to an experimenter, but they are more likely to do so certainly on the internet. So, I'm mentioning this because there are oftentimes concerns with using this kind of social media data, and of course, it's not perfect, but there are some benefits as well. Okay. So let's do a little bit of validation. So you can think of this as a validation step, right? Like we just want to see that the content of our main data set is kind of similar to the content of a representative sample. Let's do more validation. What we did in this validation study was get online participants to judge GPT's outputs for 100 randomly sampled posts as being appropriate or inappropriate. So we basically gave, for each post, the human evaluator, the post, the GPT summary of the options, and the GPT summaries of the costs and benefits. And for each step in this pipeline, we essentially asked it to tell us whether or not the GPT summary was appropriate given the textual content of the post. Okay, and we found that overall there's about a 90% accuracy rate, so 90% of GPT's outputs are considered to be appropriate. GPT's summary of the two choice options are pretty good, but the summary of the benefits and costs are a little bit worse. And you'll see that remember we asked GPT to generate 3 benefits and 3 costs. So the first benefit or cost that it generates is pretty decent, but by the time it's generating the third benefit or cost, it's kind of down to 85% accuracy, which means that, if you did want to sort of, so this question about hallucination that came up in chat, right? So it's slightly more likely to hallucinate by the time it gets to the third reason that you're asking it to generate. And that's partially because not all posts have 3 reasons. There could certainly be better ways of doing this than what we did, but that's just kind of the data, the validation accuracy. Here's another validation. Sorry, is there a question?
Just a short technical question. Which model is this? GPT what?
This is GPT 3.5. We did this before 4.0 mini, which is what I would use currently for such a large scale coding exercise. Sorry, just to be clear, also, sorry, it is 2.5, yeah. The sentence embeddings is the SBERT MPNet model, which is the leading model in the sentence embedding architecture. At least it was leading a few years ago when we started this. Okay, let's also quickly validate this step. Remember, we're taking the textual costs and benefits that GPT generates and just seeing how much of different attributes show up in that textual benefit or cost. So what we did, we asked people to essentially to judge the similarity of various pairs of GPT-generated reasons to each of the 207 attributes. So for a given attribute, let's say warmth perception, we gave it 2 GPT-generated reasons, and we asked humans to judge which of these 2 reasons is more sort of reflective of warmth perception. And we one of those reasons was one that that our sentence embedding model thought to be high on that attribute, and one that it thought to be low on the attribute. And 98.53% of the time, our human subjects saw the GPT classification to be sort of more reflective of that attribute. So this is a pretty high accuracy rate, largely because this involves the problem of textual content matching, which is, I believe, largely solved in the LLM space. So we're just trying to match the textual content of these texts, of these GPT-generated costs and benefits with the various attributes. And that's a very simple problem, at least in 2025. Okay. I'm skipping over a lot of the technical details, but happy again to elaborate. All right. So let's actually now get to the analysis, right? So we've got, each post has 207 costs and benefits. It has 2 options, and each option has 207 costs and benefits. So each dilemma is about 828 attribute values. And, you've got about 100,000 posts, 100,000 dilemmas. That's about 100 million attribute values. This would not be possible to collect before, 2021 or whenever GPTs and LLMs came out. You can't get human coders to code 100 million attributes. Okay, let's get a little bit more structure, right? So we want, this is a massive attribute space. Can we sort of condense it a little bit to understand, if you will, the latent attribute structures that characterize a lot of these life choices? So we took this matrix and then we did hierarchical clustering on this, and here are the clusters that emerge. Each of these endpoints is one of the 207 attributes from our data set, and then we've clustered them based on their occurrence frequency. So if a choice dilemma involves, one attribute, a choice option involves one attribute, does it also involve others? And we can cluster based on those co-occurrence frequencies, and you see a pretty clean division, right? At the highest level, you get clusters involving health, family, experiences, which involves arts and entertainment, sex and romance. We've got social goals like social connection, social desirability, virtues, personal growth, morality, career, and so on and so forth. Well-known attributes like money, they show up in interesting and different ways, right? So money shows up in one money and finance cluster that roughly is in the career supercluster. This is essentially making money. But you also see money show up in this other cluster, this attribute cluster, which is labeled pragmatism and financial prudence. That's spending money well. And that tends to be more kind of associated with like cleanliness and control and things like that. Likewise, let's look at social attributes, right? You've got social attributes like social connection, that's having friends, and social desirability, that is being liked by other people. And then also, of course, social dimensions related to morality, like justice and fairness and warmth and morality perception. So again, happy to sort of elaborate on this if you need, but this is, given our data set, this is the rich attribute space that we're getting. Now, what we can do with this attribute space is take a big blurb of text like this, our friend who's thinking about divorce, and convert it into numbers on option 1 and option 2. And of course, once we've got this, then we can do multi-attribute utility theory on this. All right, so what are the numbers for our poor friend? Right, if he stays, he's high on family closeness and security, somewhat on social connection, somewhat on warmth and morality perception. If he leaves, he's high on happiness and pleasure, sex and romance, achievement, freedom and courage, physical health, mental health, and several other attributes as well. Okay, these are shaded, but these are also, the shading is actually numbers that emerge out of our LLM pipeline. Okay, now we've got an attribute structure that we have extracted from about 100,000 real-life choice dilemmas. What can we do with this? We can do several things. We can study attribute trade-offs. That is, what are the attributes that people trade off in the real world? We can study the social and temporal context of these trade-offs and these dilemmas. Like, if you're an older person versus a younger person, what are the choices you're making differently? All of this kind of comes under the big bucket of ecological structure, which is what are the types of decisions that people are making in the world. We can also predict preferences and even understand decision processes, right? That's very much, I would say, like what I've been doing mostly from using lab data for most of my career. And this is, again, I would say, like in the realm of human behavior and maybe cognitive psychology. Okay, so we can build models that can take any real life dilemma and combining it with attribute weights, or even with a more sophisticated, maybe decision model, eventually predict what the person's going to do. Okay, so let me tell you just quickly about the attribute trade-offs that emerge. I'm going to show it to you at the level of our attribute clusters. And what this heat map has is essentially how often one cluster trades off against the other cluster. Okay, that is how oftentimes these types of attributes are on opposing sides in a dilemma. So again, a lot of data here. So I'm just going to zoom in into this band of. You'll see this is a pretty. There's a lot of trade-offs here. This is the fact for the money and finance cluster. So money and finance tends to trade off against a lot of other attributes. So if you've got one option that is high on money and finance, the other options are likely to be high on, well, sex and romance, marital fulfillment, social connection, social desirability. So a lot of social attributes. Okay. This actually brings me to this post. This is a real post made 3 years ago. And it's a woman. She's 28-year-old woman, and she has the dilemma of taking a better, higher paid job, or not. That's her dilemma. And of course, what makes it an interesting dilemma is that she has a 1-year-old daughter. Okay, so this is. I mentioned this post, and the reason I mentioned this is because it is the prototypical dilemma in our data set of 100,000 dilemmas. So if you put it into a multidimensional space, you find the middle point of this space. This is the post closest to that middle point. It is, in other words, reflective of the blends of attributes and trade-offs that you get when you take everyone's dilemma and put it, into one. And the reason it's sort of this prototypical post is because it has the highest. It involves a trade-off along the sort of major avenue along which these trade-offs happen, which is money on one hand, or profession, money, and career on one hand, and social and family on the other. All right. Interestingly, this prototypical post, so central, if you will, to our data set, got 0 engagement from Reddit users. Right, no upvotes, no comments, and it was kind of archived automatically after 6 months. I kind of want to reach out to this woman and see what she did and maybe do some analysis on her choices, but I don't know if that's feasible. Okay, so this is sort of the most common type of trade-off, but you also see money and finance trades off against many other types of attributes. In fact, the only thing it doesn't trade off against is professional skills and discipline and ambition. I think there are many reasons for this, which I'm happy to talk about. My favorite explanation is that people tend to think about money just as an end in itself, and that end is always in conflict with other goals and other motives that one may have. Of course, that's a very simple explanation. I'm sure there are many others that people in the audience can think of. Here's another interesting trade-off, just to give you one more example of the kinds of trade-offs that emerge. This is freedom and courage. And so what are the things that trade off against freedom and courage? Well, again, you see on the plus end, you see family closeness and pragmatism and financial prudence, money and finance, risk and stability, cleanliness and control, right? So if you've got a dilemma in which you're choosing freedom on one end, the other option is going to be high on these attributes. The things that don't trade off against freedom and courage, right, are the following: discipline, happiness, achievement, competence, confidence perception. So these tend to be attributes that show up quite often when an option has freedom and courage. Okay. Social and temporal context, right? How does the frequency of the attributes in a dilemma change based on various social and temporal factors? So again, here's our dilemma, and you'll see that this person starts off their dilemma by explaining that he's a 37-year-old man, and he's also got a wife and 2 kids, and they've got their ages and their genders. We can use this data to understand essentially the social context, right? Who are the people involved, and what is their sort of age and demographic makeup? When you've got dilemmas that involve individuals, all right, then those dilemmas tend to be typically about professional skills and money and finance. But when you've got dilemmas that involve dyads, pairs of individuals, right, you see much more social related attributes. Makes perfect sense. When you've got younger participants, so when a dilemma involves someone who's younger than the median age of 25, which is the median age of our data set, right, a lot of social attributes again. Also art and entertainment, happiness and pleasure. And when people get older, think about money, which is perhaps a little sad. Yeah, I'm above the median age in this data set. Now that was a very quick overview of the social elements. There are many other analyses that we've run in the paper, which I'm happy to talk about if you like. I'm going to quickly tell you about the temporal context, right? Remember, we know the date at which the post is made too, so we know when the person is thinking about this dilemma. And we can analyze, how does what people think about change over time? Here we've got attributes that are more common on weekends. Okay, again, nearly every attribute from social attributes to arts and entertainment, charity and loyalty, cleanliness, physical health, everything is more common on the weekends, but only on the weekdays, money and finance and professional skills and ability, right? Again, very, very kind of obvious result, but nice to see it pan out so cleanly. We also did an analysis of the effects of COVID. So we compared dilemmas that were posted during March 2020 with those that were posted in March 2019. And dilemmas that are more common in March 2020 relative to March 2019 involve physical health, cleanliness and control, but also family closeness, security, risk and stability, and mental health. I think really gives you a perspective on the kinds of choices that people were making in March 2020 versus March 2019. Okay. Could you remind me how much time I have left?
No rush. You have at least 5 or even 10 minutes. Kidding about no rush, but you have about 5
okay,
to 10 minutes.
thank you.
10 minutes, let's say.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so I'll tell you now about some of the work we've done on predicting preferences. This is kind of more preliminary. It's a little bit harder to do, but we do have some models and some tests. I suspect that many of the people in this audience would be particularly interested in predicting preferences and understanding decision processes. So our first choice prediction exercise involved getting 300 online participants in Study 4A to rate and to give us choices on 8 of the dilemmas taken from our data set. And we picked those 8 dilemmas that had the highest trade-off between family closeness and security on one hand, and pragmatism and financial prudence on the other. Okay, and this was the most common trade-off in our data set. Okay, actually, it's the second most common. The most common involved sex and romance, and we didn't want to have sex and romance dilemmas in our study. So the second most common one, and we picked basically the 8 dilemmas that sort of had the most of this trade-off. So one option is high on family closeness, one is high on pragmatism, financial prudence. And study 4B, basically the same design, but we just changed the attribute clusters. We picked 8 dilemmas that were high in the trade-off between marital fulfillment and money and finance, which is another very common trade-off. Okay, now what did we do? We gave these to human participants, and they read them, and then they rated how much they were going to choose option 1 or how much they were going to choose option 2 in each of these 8 dilemmas that they were given. And we wanted to model their preferences. Okay. First, let me show you a what I call a between subject model. Okay, so you can think of this model as predicting for a given choice dilemma how much that participant is going to rate option 1 versus option 2 on that dilemma, and we can predict that using their ratings on congruent dilemmas, that is dilemmas that involve similar attribute trade-offs, attribute profile, attribute structures, and incongruent dilemmas which involve opposite attribute structures. So if option 1 in a given target dilemma is high on family closeness and option 2 is high on financial prudence, then we're going to try and predict their preferences for option 1 over option 2 using their preferences for option 1 versus option 2 on other dilemmas in which option 1 is high on family closeness and option 2 is high on financial prudence, as well as incongruent dilemmas, which is option 1 is high on financial prudence and option 2 is high on family closeness. And so we're basically using their ratings in other dilemmas to predict their ratings in an out-of-sample dilemma. We're doing it across subjects. And we can compare that to a demographics model, for example, that just simply predicts, given, for a given dilemma, what people will do based on their age and gender. Okay,
Sorry,
and we see,
can you just clarify? So you take 7 dilemmas as a training, and then you try to predict the 8th. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So exactly. So you can think of our data set as involving, 8 dilemmas here, and 300 participants here, and each cell is their rating for option 1 versus option 2 in each of the 8 dilemmas. So then what we do is this. Okay, let's take this as our sort of target dilemma. We're going to try and predict this, and we're going to predict this column with all the other columns. So, maybe half of these columns involve congruent dilemmas, the other 3 of those columns involve congruent dilemmas, 4 involve incongruent dilemmas. So we're going to build a regression model that takes these and predicts that. And of course, we can compare that with an equivalent regression model that predicts this column with just age and gender of the participant. So how well can we do? Well, we're getting an average R-square of about 1.15 to 0.2, depending on the study, much higher than the demographics model, right? Demographic model doesn't really predict well because age and gender they can predict a little bit, but they're not going to predict so much of whether or not you'll pick, let's say in this case, family closeness or marital fulfillment. Oops, how do we get rid of this?
But in a way, the demographic model is kind of a straw man. It's just 2 variables predicting.
That's right. Actually, but just to be clear, we kind of we also had a regression. In our regression model, we actually had 2 variables as well. One was the average rating on other congruent dilemmas, and one was the average rating on other incongruent dilemmas. So parametrically, the models had similar.
Parametrically, but the meaning of the average of over, of course.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's completely true.
Sure.
I think yes, you're absolutely right. So it is a straw man. I think it is one way to sort of just compare against like what you would typically try and predict people's naturalistic choices with. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Here's a slightly different analysis. This is a little bit harder to do, right? So what we did was, for each subject, build a model specifically of the weight they're placing on these attributes. Okay. And now what we want to see is how well does that multi-attribute utility model describe an individual subject. So we're taking each individual subject. We only have 8 ratings for that subject. We're going to build a multi-attribute model that predicts those 8 ratings. And we can't fit 8 ratings on a 207-dimensional attribute structure. So we do a PCA on that attribute structure, and we just have like a 1-dimensional predictor based on the PCA to predict that person's 8 ratings. I know it's very complicated, so again, I'm happy to sort of elaborate if needed. But that allows us to do other various tests. So for example, we've got our decision model that gets an R-square of around 0.2 to 0.25, and we can compare it against a text content model, which just uses the raw text content in a very similar way to predict what ratings an individual will give on the individual level. That model does an average R-square of 0.15. But actually, if you just generate random attributes, you're also going to get an average R-square of 0.15 because there's only 8 observations, so you can fit that even if it's a randomly generated attribute structure. So this random attribute model, text content model, they kind of show that like, okay, this is a tough prediction exercise because the random baseline is already like 0.15. Decision model does significantly outperform that, by about an R-square of 0.05 to 0.1, depending on the study. I mean, the takeaway is that, okay, prediction's a little bit difficult. We only have 8 observations. We could try to get more observations, but again, remember, each dilemma involves a massive paragraph of text, which the person needs to read to and think about. So getting like 300 observations for each participant is not that easy. However, if someone who does choice prediction modeling or tournaments wanted to use this data set and run it comprehensively, I think it would make a very interesting choice prediction exercise. Can we predict real life choices that people make? We could even reach out to some of these people who have actually made the choice afterwards and kind of see what they end up doing. Or we could just get humans to make choices and then build models to predict those choices. And of course, we're not limited to 8 choice options that are high on one particular trade-off.
Sudeep, do you have some data about people in Reddit, like what they chose? I guess some of them are reporting their decision, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
Some of
you
them
have
might.
some kind of.
Yeah. Actually, what I have that I'm actually I've done some analysis is actually the commenters. So of course the posters, you can actually go and see what they chose. You can, you can't see in about 1,000 of these dilemmas, 1 to 2,000 of these dilemmas, they go and they do a post dilemma edit where they say, edit, I ended up blah, 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 or update, I did this. So that you could analyze. So that's still about 1 or 2,000 real choices. What I have, which I'm actually super excited about, let me show you again with this annoying annotation tool, is the commenters. So remember, this is people giving advice, right? So we can, so what we have here is a data set of about 100,000 commenters giving advice on our 100,000 dilemmas. It's actually something like 500,000 commenters. So we've got 500,000 people giving advice on a subset of 100,000 dilemmas. Of course, it's a very sparse matrix. Most of the cells are empty because most people don't give advice on all 100,000 dilemmas. We do have repeated observations from about 40,000 people. So this is the kind of, we have repeated observations for 40,000 people on a quantitatively characterized choice dilemma. And we can start doing interesting forms of psychometric modeling, right? You want to study why, what causes people to give different advice for dilemmas that involve similar attribute structures. You might even want to build models of each of these 40,000 people. I think that's doable as well. So it's something that I want to maybe try and do. But and for these 40,000 people, we also have their other posts, so we can get their age, gender, and other demographic information too. So I think I don't know if this could be used in a choice prediction competition or anything like that, but it is, I would say, the largest data set of real life, not decisions, but advice for decisions, which comes close. Oops, let me just delete these. Okay. All right. Okay. Last step, we can understand decision processes. I'll be quick. I know I'm out of time. We had another in study 5 and 5A and 5B. We had online participants rated their preferences for one of the study 4 dilemmas while doing a verbal protocol task, while listing the reasons that came to their mind. So what we want to do here is see, well, well, not only can we predict choices, can we maybe predict the things that people think about when they're making choices? And of course, our GPT, our modeling pipeline explicitly is able to quantify textual reasons, right? So we can use the same pipeline to quantify the reasons that people generate as they think out loud when they're deliberating in these choice problems. So again, a lot of technical details. Unfortunately, I do not have time. I'll give you just we've got one model which takes our LLM pipeline and uses it to predict the people's choices. That model does quite well because it essentially it's applied to their reasons. So they're thinking of similar things that the LLM identifies as being important. The model does much better than a demographics model, and in this study we also got a lot of personality variables, and the personalities don't predict people's choices at all. So if you're trying to predict choices, this LLM pipeline can identify the reasons that people think about, and then those reasons are very predictive, whereas demographics and personality isn't. Again, maybe during the Q&A I can explain what I did here, or maybe Ori wants to know now.
A very short clarification here. They don't read the reasons the actual posters give?
Yes, the LLM pipeline is applied to the participants' generated thoughts.
No, but the participants do not see the whole post, right? They only see.
No, they do see the post. They see the post and then they read the post and they're like, all right, well now think out loud as you deliberate, and they'll be like, oh, divorce is bad because of blah 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 blah, but this poor guy wants to do blah 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 blah, and then we take the LLM on their reasons to try and model the dynamics of their reason generation, and because again the reasons are also textual. The human generated reasons are also textual, or they're also verbal or linguistic.
Right.
Okay. I'm happy to sort of explain that more in the Q&A, but I'll just give you a quick summary of this whole project. First, I took this data set, this massive data set of people's descriptions of dilemmas they're facing in real life. I presented to you an LLM coding pipeline that takes paragraphs of unstructured text and quantifies it in terms of the attributes involved in the choice problem. And then we did a few things, like for example, understanding the structure of these attributes, how often they show up in different kinds of settings for different people. And then we also had some predictive modeling and understanding decision processes. So again, I don't think any of these steps is perfect or even close to perfect. I think there are flaws in each of these. It was a very, I think, challenging project for me. Took a long time to figure out each of these steps, and I think all of them can be improved, especially the predictive modeling. I'm not happy with those results. I think if we get enough data on people's choices, we can build much richer predictive models of what an individual is going to do. So all that means is that this is I would say not the completion of this project. It's like the starting point of, I would say, a bigger project that tries to understand real choices by combining models like multi-attribute utility theory or other types of cognitive models with LLM structure extraction. I do have a summary of the two other projects that are sort of very closely related to this that I'm also pursuing, but I won't get into that right now. I think it's just better if we move to questions. And thank you so much for your patience and for listening.
Thank you. This is super interesting. And now we have time for questions. Yeah, Peter.
I have a question about modeling attributes. Imagine one attribute is the quantity of red wine you get, the second is the quantity of white wine you get, and the third is the total quantity of wine you get. So I wonder, how would you model these attributes?
Yeah. So, firstly, so that's a challenge, right? So the way we did it was we a priori specified, let me pull it out, 207 attributes that are sort of identified in the literature, right here, right? And so, there was 5 attributes from decision theory, and of course risk, for example, wasn't specified in terms of probabilities, right? It was just sort of a general idea that this is risky or not. So if we had a wine attribute, so if we had we could, for example, have a general wine attribute if we really wanted to, right? We'd also have a specific red wine attribute and a specific white wine attribute if we wanted to, and then we would apply the same pipeline. Now, we wouldn't necessarily find that much interesting things here because, I mean, at least for most people, choosing between red and white wine is not an important life choice that they go on social media to get advice for. But if you go on, for example, let's say restaurant reviews, you would typically use this version of this pipeline to perhaps identify sentiment scores for different, let's say, food-related attributes, and in that it would make much more sense to say, like, okay, how is this for this restaurant? How are they talking about the red wine? How are they talking about the white wine, and so on and so forth? I don't know if that answered your question.
A bit, yes. But
Yeah. I think. I think the question of how to extract structure from any unstructured domain, in this case text, it's not just a problem of sort of the technical issues, right? It's a problem of specifying your own ontology, your own, if you will, graph or representational structure that you want to then fit onto the model, right? And that is in some sense more challenging than the technical issues of doing a LLM coding. I think when LLMs came out, I wanted to like apply structure extraction to much more complicated reasoning problems, right? Can you take like rich reasoning problems and translate them into graphs or other forms of structured representations on which you can apply cognitive algorithms, cognitive models to understand how people reason? That's been the goal of sort of cognitive science for decades. It's not that easy because you need to specify a flexible enough ontology and flexible enough sort of representational schema such that any reasoning problem can sort of match that. And this is a similar problem here we're facing with multi-attribute decision making. And our goal has been to specify a general schema of attributes that might be relevant. And of course, the schema is not comprehensive and does not include red and white wine as a separate attribute that people might consider.
yeah, okay.
Yuri,
ask
go
one?
ahead.
All right. So maybe I'm not interpreting Peter's question correctly, but I was wondering about a similar thing about attribute trade-offs. Can you go there, please?
Mm,
The one with the two. Yeah, not
yeah.
one before. No. I mean that
This?
one. No.
Yeah.
The next one. Another one. Yeah, that one. Right. So let's say that I have amount of white wine and amount of red wine, and I'm choosing between white and red. So one would get very blue on one side, the other would get very red on the other side. But then I have also an attribute of total amount of wine that I have. So take Peter's example. Um, so with that, clearly it's a relevant attribute, right? Because the total amount of wine is relevant to the choice between. So whether it's more red or more white is relevant. But then, where would that turn out?
Yeah.
What's the trade-off here?
Yeah. So I mean, again, what we're doing is a priori specifying a bunch of things that could be traded off against each other. Our schema doesn't include red and white wine.
No, but I mean, any two attributes can also completely trade off one another, but can also not completely trade off. They can somehow correlate.
Yeah,
Some
absolutely.
cases and others not.
Completely, right? So firstly, this clustering solution comes out of those attribute correlations. So a lot of, let's say, just as an example, oops. Let's just take the first. These are all mental health attributes. So, being happy and feeling calm, right? If a choice option leads to feeling happy, it also usually leads to feeling calm. It also usually leads to reducing stress, right? And so those are all like highly correlated attributes. And for the purpose of our analysis, we just said, like, listen, we're just going to pool them and call it a mental health attribute. Now, mental health and physical health are also quite correlated, but for now we're just kind of like separating them based on this hierarchical clustering solution into separate buckets. But oftentimes, mental health and physical health are both achieved through the same option. Whereas conversely, like professional skills and ability, right, might oftentimes show up in a different option. So I guess if you take this kind of this is our data, right? You can and we kind of you can subtract the benefits from the cost to get a single option or an option 2 vector, right? You can then compare how these columns show up against each other, and that's what I mean by trade-offs, and that's what I do in this cluster.
Okay, so you actually do the subtraction between the attributes, or?
Yeah, we do option when we do the clustering and also the trade-offs. We actually subtract the benefits from the cost, which then of course makes you ask, why did you even bother with generating separate benefits and separate costs?
A little bit.
Well,
Yeah.
it's because LLMs are not very great at negation. So let's say if I have like an attribute like this does not lead to mental health, or does not lead to risk, this does not lead to stress, versus this leads to stress. Now, if we just code for, the stress relatedness, it's not going to be easy to disentangle those. So you kind of want to do a separate coding. Is this a benefit of the option? It does not lead to stress. This is a cost of the option and that helps deal with the sort of negation problem that shows up so much, not just in this, but in text analysis more generally. So that's a very long-winded answer to a problem that I raised myself, but.
All right. Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Okay, guys, this is super interesting, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So I want to thank you again. And now those who have to go are free to leave. Thank you. And we will stay for informal discussion for about, as I said, 15 more minutes if it's fine with you.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you everyone for coming and for the wonderful comments.
I think I will stop the recording, right, Ori?
Yeah. So